In the year the snows came early to Kangwon province, a simple woodcutter named Jean carried two strangers down from the mountain. He did not know he was also carrying the fate of his master's house on his back. But let us go back to the beginning of that day. The house of Master Quan was not a house, but a small kingdom of commerce. People called him the Merchant Lord, and for good reason. His storehouses were filled to the rafters with treasures. There were towering stacks of grain sacks, bundles of fine silk, and heavy bags of medicinal herbs that scented the air. Crates of salt and jars of oil lined the walls. Every day, ox carts groaned in and out of the main gate, and merchants with sharp eyes and quick minds haggled in the courtyard from dawn until dusk. The entire estate hummed with the sound of business. In this busy house lived a servant named Jean. He had served there for many years and was now a man of 40, still unmarried. Jean was a man of few words, but his work spoke for him. He was always the first to rise, sweeping the courtyard in the pre-dawn chill. He quietly took on the hardest jobs, the ones others avoided. Even the merchant lord, Master Quan, saw his worth. He would often say to his guests, "That Jean, he works as if the task were his own. One servant like him is worth 10 others." But there was one man who soured whenever he heard this praise. That man was the steward, Suk. Master Suk was the one who managed the entire household. He watched over the flow of goods, assigned tasks to the servants, and dealt with the traders. It was a position of considerable power, and he enjoyed the feeling of it. He liked how the other servants watched his face for a sign of his mood. He liked that a single word from him could set the whole house in motion. But the sight of Jean always unsettled him. In Suk's eyes, the master favored the quiet woodcutter too much. On that cold winter day, Jean had been on the mountain since dawn, cutting firewood. With every swing of his axe, his breath exploded in a white cloud. The cold was so sharp that his hands grew numb, making it hard to grip the wooden handle. Only when the sun began to dip toward the horizon did he finally finish. He bundled the dry branches and hoisted them onto his A-frame carrier. The load was heavy, making the wooden frame creak. Leaning on his staff for support, Jean began the long walk down the mountain path. The sun had already fallen behind the ridge. The air grew colder, and a sharp wind whistled through the trees, biting at his ears and the tip of his nose. It was then that he saw it. As he passed a large, snow-dusted boulder, he noticed a dark shape in the shadow beneath it. He moved closer. Two people were huddled on the frozen ground. A young woman was curled tightly around a small child, holding the little one to her chest. The woman's lips were blue, and her breath was a shallow, fragile thing. The child in her arms was limp and still. There was no telling how long they had been there, exposed to the wind and the falling snow. Yet, even in this state, the woman had not loosened her grip on the child. Jean set down his carrier and knelt beside them. He took the woman's hand. It was as cold as ice. He touched the child's cheek and felt almost no warmth left. If he left them here, they would surely perish. Without a second thought, he unstrapped his bundle of firewood. A full day's work, his only task, scattered and lost in the snow. But there was no time for regret. He gently placed the small child, Ari, onto the empty carrier and tied her securely so she would not fall. He then helped the young woman, Un, to her feet, letting her lean against the carrier as he supported her with one arm. And so, Jean started down the mountain again, carrying two people instead of firewood. His feet sank into the deep snow, and his body swayed with every step. The wind howled at his back, trying to push him over, but he could not stop. By the time the lights of the village below came into view, his legs had almost no strength left. He paused at the edge of the village, just before the warm glow of Master Quan's estate. A new fear, colder than the wind, took hold of him. He was a mere servant. How could he bring these strangers, a woman and a child with no name and no story, into his master's home? As a servant, he could not bring strangers inside on his own authority. Jean made a decision. He carefully carried the woman and child to the driest spot he could find, under the wide eaves of the servants' quarters. He laid them down gently, out of the worst of the wind. Then he ran toward the main house to find Master Quan. He burst into the warm hall, his breath pluming in the air. "Master, I saw two people freezing on the mountain path," he gasped, trying to calm his racing heart. "A young woman and a small child. If we leave them, they will not see the morning." Jean bowed his head low, his voice pleading. "Please, Master, let them have a warm corner for just one night." Before the Master could speak, another man stepped forward. It was Master Suk, the steward of the household. "Master Quan, you must not," he said, his voice sharp and thin. "We do not know who these people are." The steward's face was a mask of disapproval. "To bring such vagrants into our home is to invite trouble. What if they carry sickness, or worse? It is proper to send them away." They were truly heartless words. Master Quan did not answer the steward. Instead, his gaze settled on Jean, studying the young woodcutter who stood trembling before him. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then, the Master spoke a quiet question. "Is one night all you ask?" "Yes, Master," Jean replied, his hopes surging. "Just enough to let them live." Master Quan gave a short, sharp nod. "Bring them in. Prepare an empty room. Light a fire at once." A great sigh of relief escaped Jin's lips. He hurried back to the outer building and carried the woman and her child inside. He settled them in a small, bare room. First, he warmed water and gently moistened their cracked lips. Then he took his own portion of rice, saved for his supper, and cooked it with much water into a thin, weak porridge. He knew he could not feed them much at once. He spooned tiny drops into their mouths. For several days, neither the woman nor the child stirred from their deep sleep. Jin's life found a new rhythm. He would rise in the dark, light the fire in their room, and set a pot of water to warm before he left for the mountain. At night, he returned not to his own rest, but to their side, to boil another small measure of porridge. He simply waited, hoping for them to open their eyes. After some days had passed, it was the woman who woke first. She looked around the unfamiliar room with wide, frightened eyes. She tried to sit up, but her body had no strength, and she swayed. Her first thought was not for herself. "Ari," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Where's Ari?" Her gaze fell upon the small form sleeping beside her, and only then did she seem to breathe. She touched the child's cheek. It was warm. At that touch, tears finally spilled from her eyes and ran down her thin face. It was then she saw Jean, sitting quietly in the corner of the room. She asked, her voice trembling, "Are you the one who saved us?" Jean only nodded. "You had collapsed on the mountain," he said softly. "You and the child." The woman was silent for a long time, as if she could not find the words. At last, she spoke. "Thank you. Truly, I thank you. My name is Un. This child," she said, pulling the small girl closer, "is named Ari." Un took a shaky breath and added one more thing. "Ari was hurt when she was very small. She cannot speak." Jean said nothing. He simply looked at the child. Ari, nestled in her mother's embrace, stared back at him with large, dark, silent eyes. If Jean had not chosen to abandon his firewood on that mountain path, the lives of these three people would never have been woven together. But at that moment, nobody knew. No one could have known that the events begun on the mountain that day would one day shake Master Quan's great house to its very foundations. Even after Un's strength returned, she and Ari could not leave. The winter cold still held the land in its grip, and the child was still too weak for the road. Master Quan did not force them out, but he had not planned for them to stay long. Un understood this well. She could not live on another's kindness forever. So as her body healed, she began to help. If she saw laundry drying in the courtyard, she would gather and fold it. If she found a torn garment, she would quietly mend it with neat, small stitches. When a servant struggled with a heavy water jug, she would lend her small strength. Where she saw dust on the floor, she would sweep and wipe without a word. No one asked her to do these things. It was simply her way of repaying the life she had been given. Soon, the other servants began to talk among themselves. That woman, Un, her hands are so skillful. She sees what needs to be done and does it without being told. These words, as all words do, eventually reached the ears of Master Quan. Around that time, Jean went to see his master again. He bowed low. "Master Quan, may I have a word?" "Speak," the master said. Jean took a breath. "The woman, is quick-witted and works very hard. Would you consider letting her stay a while longer?" He hesitated for just a moment before pressing on. "We are short of hands in the household. She would be a true help with the work." Master Quan stroked his chin, deep in thought. It was true. He had been considering hiring more help. The estate was large, and with so many visitors, the work of laundry and cleaning was endless. "Very well," he declared. "We will observe her for a while longer." A look of relief washed over Jin's face. But the face of the man standing nearby, the steward Master Suk, was the very picture of displeasure. "Master Quan," he began, his voice tight, "to keep a woman of unknown origin in this household. She works well, does she not?" The master cut him short. "That is enough." Master Suk fell silent, but a coldness crept into his eyes. He was a man who felt at ease only when every matter in the household, large or small, passed through his own hands. And now, because of Jean, a new person was finding her place without his consent. From that day on, Master Suk began to work Jean, the thorn in his side, with a cruel and relentless hand. One day, he sent Jean up the mountain at dawn. He said, "You will bring back 2 loads of firewood before the sun sets." 2 loads was usually the work of 2 full days. But Jean, without a word of complaint, went up the mountain. As the sun began to dip below the peaks, Jean finally returned, carrying the 2 heavy loads. His shoulders were raw and swollen. His breath came in ragged gasps. He set down the A-frame carrier, hoping for a moment's rest. But Master Suk was there at once. He said, "The cesspit behind the outhouse is full. Go and empty it immediately." Jean had only just set down his burden. But in the steward's eyes, even that brief pause was an offense. "Why are you dawdling?" Master Suk shouted. "Will you not go at once?" Without a word, Jean propped up his carrier and walked toward the outhouse. The sour smell stung his nose. His swollen shoulders screamed with pain as he dragged the heavy container. By the time Jean finished the task and went to the kitchen, the evening meal had long been cleared away. All that was left for him, on a corner of the kitchen floor, was half a bowl of cold rice and a little chilled soup. Jean picked up the bowl without a word. He went outside and sat alone on the edge of the cool wooden porch, forcing the cold food into his mouth. Still, not a single word of complaint passed his lips. The next day was even worse. From morning, Jean hauled sacks of grain, each weighing as much as a grown man, to the storehouse. After 10 sacks, his shoulders were numb and puffy. As he tried to catch his breath, Master Suk called to him again. "Go to the well. Fill the great water jar." His shoulders were already raw from the grain sacks. Now, the wooden yoke of the water carrier dug into the same bruised flesh. For a moment, Jin's face twisted in pain. But only 2 words came from his mouth. "Yes, master." He clenched his teeth and walked back and forth from the well. Each time the heavy bucket sloshed, his skin was chafed and pressed. Heat flared from his shoulders with every trip. After several journeys, the skin on one shoulder finally broke. Blood began to seep through the fabric of his tunic. Yet Master Suk did not let him rest. As soon as the water jar was full, he was ordered to the back of the main house to restack the entire woodpile. Clutching his bleeding shoulder, Jean moved every last log. By the time he was finished, night had fallen and the world was dark. Even his steps were heavy as he entered his small room. He closed the door and slowly, carefully, removed his upper garment. The act of undressing was itself an effort. His shoulder was revealed. The crushed and chafed flesh was an angry red, and dried blood had stuck the cloth to his skin. Jean gritted his teeth, wiping away the blood with a rag soaked in cold water. He pressed down on the wound himself, tending to it alone, and finally wrapped his shoulder. Not once did he make a sound of pain. The next morning, Un was drawing water at the well. Jean came to fill his own water pails. Un glanced at him, then her eyes stopped. She saw the stain of blood on the collar of his tunic. When he lifted the pails, he could not use one shoulder properly. His face winced with pain each time he moved his arm. Jean tried to walk past as if nothing was wrong, but Un's eyes did not miss it. Her heart sank. Only then did she begin to understand how terribly Master Sook had been driving him. From that day, Un watched Jean more closely. She saw how, from dawn until dusk, the sweat never dried on his face. She saw how he would be called back to work without even finishing a single spoonful of his meal. The sight of it settled heavily in her heart. And so, Un resolved to earn her place, not as a guest, but as a working hand. Though Jean never spoke of his burdens, she saw them in the stoop of his shoulders as he returned at dusk. She saw them in the way he always found Ari first, to check if the child was warm, before turning to her to ask, "Was your day peaceful, Un?" He, who was surely the most tired of all, always cared for them first. The thought weighed on her like a stone. She worried that she and her daughter had only added to the weight on his back. So, Un began to work with a quiet fire. At first, she took on simple tasks in the vast household, folding laundry and sweeping the rooms of the main house. At night, by the light of a single oil lamp, her needle would fly, mending torn clothes for the other servants. Soon, word began to spread of her nimble fingers and her careful work. One day, the head cook beckoned her into the kitchen. She began by trimming vegetables and testing the flavor of soup broths. The cook watched her, a gruff woman with flour on her nose. She saw how Un's knife flew, turning radishes into paper-thin slices. She watched her taste a stew, her brow furrowed in concentration, before adding just a pinch more soy sauce. The cook's eyes widened. "Ego," she muttered to the steam rising from a pot. Who knew this woman had such a gift for flavor? From that day forward, Un became a true part of the kitchen. Whenever the sweet, fragrant smell of roasting chestnuts drifted from the kitchen doors, the other servants knew Un was there. Little Ari was also changing. When Jean was in the courtyard splitting logs for the winter, the child would sit quietly nearby, just watching him. When he paused to rest, she would silently approach his side. Jean would turn and look at her, and Ari would offer a small, shy smile. Jean treasured the child. If there was ever a special treat, a piece of fruit or a rice cake, he saved it for Ari first. On cold days, he would take her small hands in his and blow his warm breath on them until they were pink again. At first, Jean had only wanted to help them out of pity. He could not bring himself to leave a mother and child to die on a mountain path. But as the days passed, watching the gentle and hard-working Un, his heart began to change. And his affection grew for the silent child who saved her brightest smiles just for him. Jean found himself lying awake at night, his thoughts turning over and over. At last, he made up his mind. He wanted to marry Un. He wanted Ari to be his daughter. He wanted them to live together as one family. Jean went to see Master Quan, the wealthy merchant who owned the entire household. He knelt on the wooden floor, bowing his head so low his forehead nearly touched the grain of the wood. "Master Quan," he began, "I have something to ask of you." The master looked up from his papers. "What is it?" "I wish to marry Un," Jean said, his voice quiet but firm. Master Quan's eyes widened in surprise. Jean continued, his words coming faster. "Un is a good and diligent woman. Ari is a beautiful child. I want to protect them for the rest of my life." His voice began to tremble with the weight of his hope. "We would be fine with a small room. I will work harder than I have ever worked before. Please, I beg you, permit our marriage." The merchant looked at Jean for a long time. There was no real reason to refuse. They both worked in his house, and their marriage would cause no loss to the estate. Very well, Master Quan said finally. I permit it. Tears welled in Jin's eyes. He bowed even lower. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you, truly. But when Master Suk, the steward, heard the news, a sour bile rose in his throat. A mere woodcutter, daring to take a wife. And worse, the very woman he himself had brought into the household. Master Suk ground his teeth. He could not bear to see things go so well for Jin right before his eyes. From that day on, his dislike for the woodcutter became a sharp and open hatred. Jin, however, was no longer alone. And so, Jin and Un were married quietly. There was no grand feast. No musicians played in the courtyard. But in the small room granted to them, 3 people became a family. That night, Jin lifted Ari into his arms. The little girl wrapped her arms tightly around his neck and held on. Un watched them, a gentle smile on her face. We are a family now, she said softly. Jin nodded, hugging Ari close. His eyes were red, but a smile touched his lips. For a man who had lived alone until he was 40 years old, he had a family for the very first time. Spring was coming. The snow melted from the hillsides, and the wind lost its icy bite. Sunlight began to spill into the courtyard again. Ari loved that sunlight. As the days grew warmer, she spent more and more time playing alone in the small yard behind the servants' quarters. Ari was a child with exceptionally keen eyes. If she saw a beetle crawling on a blade of grass, she would watch it for a long time. She would touch a dry, swaying stem with her fingertip just to see it tremble. If she saw an ant carrying a crumb, she would follow it all the way to its home. She missed no small movement, and what she saw once, she remembered for a long, long time. Unable to speak, she had grown used to understanding the world with her eyes and her ears. On that day, too, Ari was playing in the backyard. It was then that she saw it. From the corner of the backyard, near the stone wall, came the sound of a hushed voice. Ari lifted her head. There, in the deep shade of the wall, Master Suk, the steward, was meeting with someone. It was a stranger, a face she had never seen at the merchant's house. He had a short beard beneath his chin, eyes like narrow slits, and cheekbones that stood out like stones under his skin. His clothes looked ordinary enough, the simple garb of a traveling salesman. Ari crouched beside a patch of tall grass and did not take her eyes off them. Master Suk glanced around once, then drew a small bundle from inside his robes. It was about the size of 2 hands placed together, wrapped tightly in cloth. Master Suk passed it to the stranger. The man took it with both hands and quickly tucked it into his own robes. Then he pressed something small into the steward's waiting palm. Master Suk received it, and, just as quickly, hid it in his sleeve. The movements of their hands were swift, like birds taking flight. A moment later, they gave each other a single, sharp nod and separated, each walking in a different direction. The stranger slipped out through a narrow gap beside the wall. Master Suk walked back toward the main house as if nothing had happened at all. Ari had watched everything, from the beginning to the end. That night, it began. Lying beside her mother in their small room, Ari could not fall asleep. The scene she had witnessed that afternoon kept playing over and over in her mind. Gently, she tugged on the sleeve of her mother, Un. Un turned and looked at her daughter in the dim light. What is it, Ari? She seemed to ask with her eyes. Can you not sleep? Ari shook her head. Then, with her small hands, she began to tell Un what she had seen. She described how Master Suk had met a strange man in the backyard. She shaped her hands to show what the man looked like. She mimed the quick exchange of the bundle and the small object, and how they had parted in silence. Anyone else would have seen only a child's strange game. But Un had spoken this silent language with her daughter since Ari was a baby. She understood every word her child meant to say. For a long moment, Un simply watched Ari's face. Then she quietly pulled the child into her arms. You did well, she whispered, her voice a soft hum against Ari's hair. You did very well." Ari buried her face in her mother's embrace. Un stroked her daughter's head, her mind racing. An ordinary transaction would have happened at the front gate. Salesmen and merchants came and went from this house every day. There was no reason to meet in secret by the back wall. It was a suspicious thing, but Un did not act rashly. What a child sees once is not yet proof. A few days later, the front gate of the estate was bustling from early afternoon. An ox cart laden with goods arrived, and merchants came and went. In the house of a great merchant, this was a common sight. Ari was playing in a corner of the main courtyard when she looked toward the gate. Her eyes suddenly froze. It was the same man she had seen in the backyard. The short beard, the narrow eyes, the sharp cheekbones. There was no mistake. But this time, he was not in the shadows of the backyard. He was walking right through the main gate. The stranger entered the courtyard without a hint of shame. Master Sook greeted him casually, as one would greet a familiar business partner. "You have traveled far," the steward said loudly. "Your efforts are appreciated." Master Sook ordered a servant to bring out goods from the storehouse. 2 bundles of fine silk were brought out, and a large sack of medicinal herbs followed. The stranger took them and loaded them onto his ox cart. The other people in the household thought nothing of it. In a house where goods moved daily, it was easy to assume a new supplier had been found. But Ari watched his every move. She did not miss a single thing. She counted the silk bundles. She marked the size of the sack of herbs in her mind. She even memorized the order in which he loaded the items onto the cart. That night, Ari once again tugged on her mother's sleeve. Un looked at her daughter and asked softly, "That man came again, did he not?" Ari nodded her head. Then, with her hands, she began to describe the day's events, piece by piece. Un's eyes grew sharp. She lay awake for a long time that night, unable to sleep. The first secret meeting, she now understood, was likely to arrange things, to learn a face. After that, they would use the front gate, pretending it was all normal business. On the surface, it looked like simple trade, but the secret beginning stained everything that followed. Un knew she did not yet have proof, but she also knew this was not a matter to be ignored. "Ari," she said, her touch gentle, "from now on, if that man comes again, you must be sure to tell your mother." Ari nodded her head. From that day forward, Ari became a small, silent shadow. Whenever the stranger came to the merchant's house, her eyes followed him, marking the hour of his arrival and the shape of the bundles he carried away. And each night, when the house was asleep, she would find her mother, Un. In the dim light of a single oil lamp, her small hands would fly, weaving stories in a silent language of flickering fingers and tilted palms. In this way, the girl who could not speak became the clearest eyes in the entire household. For Un, the nights were no longer the same. By day, she was a ghost in the compound, a quiet and diligent woman washing clothes by the well or stirring pots in the kitchen, her face calm and unreadable. But when darkness fell, she became a keeper of secrets, missing not a single detail of the stories Ari told with her hands. The stranger continued to visit every few days, and each time, Master Sook, the steward, would greet him personally. It was no longer a coincidence. It was a pattern. "This is not a matter to be ignored," Un whispered to herself in the quiet of the pantry. Yet, she could not speak of it to anyone. What proof did she have to bring before the great merchant, Master Quan? The memory of a child, told through gestures a stranger could not understand, was no weapon against a trusted man like the steward. Un thought for a long time. She could not let what Ari had seen remain only in memory. It had to be given form. It had to be recorded. She found a forgotten scrap of hemp cloth, coarse and gray, from a corner of the servants' quarters. With a needle and thread, she began to stitch a secret history. A different colored thread marked what kind of goods were taken. The quantity was recorded in a different way. Using the beans and red azuki beans from her own kitchen, she filled tiny pouches, a bean for each measure, and hid them. She arranged the pouches in the order of her stitches on the cloth. No one thought it strange. They were just kitchen supplies, after all. Who would suspect the woman in charge of the meals for counting out her beans? Un hid the cloth and its growing collection of pouches deep within the folds of her spare clothing. The days passed. The lines of stitching on the cloth grew longer, and the small bags of beans multiplied. What began as a single, small bundle became two after a month had passed. The secret trade was more frequent than she had first imagined. Un took a deep breath. She had to wait. If she spoke too soon and Master Sook simply denied everything, her own position would become impossible. The steward was a man of power in the household, who had stood by Master Kwan's side for many years. So Un held her tongue and waited. All the while, the life of Jean, the woodcutter, did not change. He rose before the sun to sweep the yard, split firewood, and haul heavy sacks of grain. He ran here and there, doing whatever Master Sook commanded. One day, a cold Kangwon rain began to fall, not in drops, but in gray sheets. Even so, Master Sook sent Jean out into the storm. He said, "The embankment by the field below the mountain has collapsed. Go and mend it with stones." The rain was a torrent, and Jin's clothes were soaked through in moments. He stood in the churning mud, lifting one heavy, slick stone after another to build up the wall. His hands slipped, and more than once a rock crashed down upon his feet. When he finally returned, caked in mud from head to toe, Master Sook threw a cold word at him. "Is that all you could manage? Go again tomorrow." Jean only bowed his head, saying nothing. From the kitchen doorway, Un saw it all. Her hand, holding a soup ladle, froze in midair. Her knuckles turned white around the wooden handle. That night, she took Jin's clothes to wash them. They were heavy, weighted down with mud and rainwater. The water was icy cold, and her hands grew numb, but she did not stop. She decided then that she would carry the secret of Master Sook's dealings alone for a while longer. She would do it to protect Jean. He knew nothing of this. He simply worked, his back strong and his spirit quiet. When he returned in the evening, he would lift little Ari into his arms, and his tired face would break into a smile. He would ask, "Did my Ari play well today?" Ari would nod and wrap her small arms tightly around his neck. Jean laughed, and seeing them, Un laughed too. But behind her smile, a decision had settled, hard and cold as a river stone. A time would come. She swore it to herself in the deepest part of her heart. And when that time came, she would not miss her chance. One morning, the entire household was in a flurry of motion. The merchant lord, Master Kwan, was preparing to leave for a great trade in a distant province. Servants bustled about, packing luggage and loading goods onto a heavy ox cart. In the main courtyard, Master Kwan called his steward to his side. He said, "Keep the house in good order while I am gone. I will return in 7 days." Master Sook bowed low. He replied, "Yes, Master Kwan." The steward's voice was full of respect, and his face was a mask of loyalty. But as he bowed, no one saw the greedy smile that flickered across his lips for just a moment. He stood at the main gate, watching with that same loyal face as the ox cart rumbled down the path and disappeared around the bend in the village road. Only when it was completely gone did Master Sook turn around. The smile was no longer hidden. For several days, the entire household was in the steward's hands. Then, word arrived unexpectedly from a fast rider. Master Kwan's business in the capital had gone better than planned. He was returning home early. That same night, the child, Ari, awoke in the dark. She needed to visit the outhouse and quietly slid open the paper door of her room. Pale moonlight washed over the courtyard, and the sound of summer insects droned from the trees. As she started toward the back of the house, her small feet suddenly stopped. She heard voices coming from the rear garden. Holding her breath, Ari tiptoed toward the sound. She pressed herself into the deep shadow of the garden wall and peered around the edge. There stood Master Sook, and with him was the stranger with the unsettling eyes. The steward spoke in a low, urgent whisper. He said, "I will have all the goods ready to send tomorrow at midday. This will be the last shipment." The stranger nodded. He asked, "How many carts should I bring? And should I enter through the main gate?" "Yes," said Master Sook. "Act as if you are a merchant from a northern trading house. No one will ever know." The two men shared a quiet, ugly laugh. Ari felt her whole body turn to ice, but she did not move. She watched until the two men finished their business. She saw the stranger slip away over the back wall. She saw Master Sook wipe his mouth with his sleeve, his face full of triumph, as he walked back toward the main house. Only then did Ari turn and run back to her room. She shook her mother's arm fiercely. Un's eyes flew open in alarm. Her daughter's eyes were wide with fright, and her breath came in short, sharp gasps. The child's hands began to move, her fingers flying in a frantic story of what she had seen in the garden. Un understood at once. He was meeting that man again in the darkness of the garden. Ari nodded with all her might. Un's mind raced. A large shipment tomorrow. It was clear now. The steward was planning to use the master's absence to steal everything at once. That night, Un could not find sleep. The small flame of the oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the wall. Ari, exhausted by her fear, was asleep again in her mother's arms. Un knew she had to stop the goods from leaving. She had to buy time until Master Quan returned. But she could not use force. She held no power over the other servants. If the wife of a simple woodcutter dared to stand in the steward's path, she would be the one cast out in disgrace. After a long time, her thoughts came to rest on the kitchen. It was the one place that was her own, the place from which the steward's own dinner tray came each day. She reached under her sleeping mat and pulled out a small cloth pouch. Inside was a wild herb she had gathered on the mountain. It was not a poison that would kill, but a root that would twist a man's gut into knots and leave him helpless for an entire day. She looked at the crushed root in her palm. An image of Jean, the woodcutter, rose in her mind. She saw his kind smile, even as he held a shoulder bruised by a falling log. She saw him sitting alone at the edge of the courtyard, eating cold rice after a long day. She saw his tired form returning at dusk, soaked with rain and covered in mud. And she saw the gentle way he smiled whenever he took Ari's hand. Her resolve hardened. She wrapped the herb powder in a small scrap of cloth and tucked it deep inside her tunic. The next morning dawned. Un was in the kitchen before the first rooster crowed. She lit the fire in the earthen stove and set the great iron pot of rice to cook. She prepared the side dishes, ladled the soup, and arranged the breakfast trays for all the servants. Last of all, she prepared a separate tray for Master Sook. She glanced around the kitchen. No one was there. She took the cloth from her tunic and carefully unfolded it. With silent fingers, she tipped the fine powder into the steward's bowl of hot soup. It dissolved without a trace, vanishing into the savory broth. The soup looked no different than it did any other morning. Un gave the soup one last stir with a spoon, then lifted the tray. Her steps were even as she walked from the kitchen. Her face showed nothing. A few moments later, Master Sook accepted his breakfast, just as he always did. He finished the bowl of soup and cleaned his plate of rice. After the tray was taken away, Master Sook, the steward, muttered to himself as if speaking to a ghost. Today is the last day. He turned to go inside, to prepare for the day's secret transaction. But by the time the sun was high overhead, a change had come over the steward's face. It had turned the color of old paper, and a clammy sheen of sweat beaded on his forehead. Master Sook clutched his middle with a sharp grunt. A knot of fire was twisting deep in his belly. He gritted his teeth and tried to walk to the main courtyard, but he could not manage more than 2 steps before his legs gave way and he collapsed to the floor. "Why is my stomach doing this?" he groaned, hugging his belly as if trying to hold himself together. His face grew sallow, and streams of cold sweat trickled down his neck. A servant hurried to his side. The servant asked, "Master Sook, are you well?" "I am fine," he snapped. "It will pass in a moment." But his body refused to listen. He staggered to the outhouse and back, again and again, his steps growing weaker each time. Finally, the steward gave up and fell into his bedding. He pulled the thick quilt over his head, his groans muffled by the cotton, unable to so much as look toward the courtyard. The hour was drawing near, the time when the stranger would arrive from the mountains, leading his ox cart down from Sori Pass. But Master Sook could not move. At last, the stranger came, pulling his heavy cart to a halt before the main gate. He waited for a time, but when the steward did not appear, there was nothing he could do. A servant was sent out to the gate with a message. The servant said, "The steward has been taken suddenly ill. It will not be possible today." The stranger's face, weathered by mountain winds, became a mask of stone. He said nothing. In the end, he had no choice but to turn his empty ox cart around and begin the long journey back up the pass. That evening, as the sun began to dip behind the western peaks, the front gate grew busy once more. The sound of ox cart wheels crunched on the gravel path. Master Quan, the merchant lord of the household, had returned. In the kitchen, Un heard the sounds and slowly set down the ladle she was holding. Her heart began to pound against her ribs, but she took a long, deep breath and forced her hands to be steady. Un went to her small room. From deep within a pile of folded clothes, she pulled out a small, heavy bundle wrapped in plain cloth. Inside was a long strip of stitched linen, a small bag of soybeans, and another of red beans. She waited. She waited until Master Quan had settled into the main house, the part of the estate reserved for the Lord himself. Soon, a servant entered the master's chamber and bowed. The servant announced, "Master, the young woman Un is waiting outside. She says she has something she must tell you." Master Quan looked up from his papers. "Un, what could she want? Let her enter." Un came into the room. She held the bundle in her hands, and the small child, Ari, clung to her skirt, her eyes wide. Un walked to the center of the room and knelt low before the merchant lord. She spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Master, I beg your forgiveness. It is not my place as a servant to dare seek an audience with you." Master Quan waved a hand. "What is it? Speak your mind." Un took one more breath. She said, "Master Sook has been stealing from this house." The merchant lord's eyes grew wide. "What did you say?" "She has been secretly trading this house's goods with a stranger," Un repeated. Master Quan leaned forward, his expression sharp. "What is this foolishness? Do you have any proof?" In answer, Un untied her bundle and spread its contents on the polished wooden floor. The long strip of linen unrolled, revealing a dense pattern of tiny stitches. Beside it, she placed the bag of soybeans and the bag of red beans. She began to explain, her finger tracing the strange records she had made. Master Quan picked up the stitched cloth and held it to the lamplight. He even opened the bag of soybeans and poured a few into his palm, counting them himself. Slowly, the merchant lord's face began to harden. Un told him everything. She explained how her daughter Ari had first seen the secret meetings. She described how the child, who could not speak, had shown her everything using only her hands and her eyes. At first, Master Quan found it difficult to believe. He had known Master Sook for many years and had entrusted the man with the entire household's fortune. But the records Un presented were too specific, too detailed to be a simple lie. There were dates marked by knots in a string. There were counts kept in beans. There were quantities recorded in careful stitches. This was not the work of a fantasist. At last, Master Quan spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "This must be verified." He immediately summoned his household staff. "Go to the granary and the storehouses at once," he commanded. "Compare the official ledgers with the actual inventory. Count every last item." The servants lit torches and hurried into the darkening courtyard. The heavy doors of the storehouses were unbarred. The counting began. Before long, a head servant ran back, his face pale in the torchlight. He reported, "Master, the goods in the storehouse do not match the numbers in the ledgers." Master Kwan's face became like stone. He spoke one final command. Search the steward's room. Now, the servants swarmed across the courtyard toward Master Sook's quarters. Inside, the steward was still lying in his bed, clutching his stomach, moaning softly beneath his quilt. "What is this outrage?" Master Sook shrieked. But the servants did not stop. The command had come from Master Kwan himself. They descended upon the steward's quarters. They tore the room apart with the quiet fury of men following a lord's command. They ripped back the sleeping quilt and scattered bundles of clothing tied in silk cloths. They pried up the very floorboards of the polished wooden porch. And there, in the dark space beneath, a servant's hand touched something wrapped in fabric. He pulled out a heavy bundle, tied with rough twine. When the knot was undone, a cascade of silver coins spilled onto the floor, glinting in the afternoon light. It was the payment for all the goods he had siphoned from the household. Beside the money lay a small, slim book. It was Master Sook's own private ledger. Inside, he had meticulously recorded his treachery, on which day, what goods, and in what quantity, all written in his own neat script. Master Kwan took the little book from the servant's hands. He spread it open next to the humble scrap of sewing cloth that Un had brought him. He laid them side by side and began to compare them, line by line. The dates matched. The quantities matched. A fine tremor started in Master Kwan's hand. "This wretch," the merchant lord breathed, his jaw tight. "He dared to deceive my eyes." At that moment, Master Sook was dragged from his room and forced to his knees in the center of the dusty courtyard. He was still bent over, clutching his stomach, a pitiful and staggering sight. Master Kwan stood over him, his shadow falling across the kneeling man. "Do you have anything to say?" Master Sook looked up, his face a mask of fear. "Master Kwan," he pleaded, his voice thin. "This is a plot. I have only ever served this house." Silence. The roar echoed off the courtyard walls, making even the oldest, steadiest servants flinch. "You, who I trusted. You who stole from me, hiding your crimes in plain sight. It is all here." He threw the little ledger down in the dust before Sook. "Written by your own hand. In a book kept by your own hand." The blood drained from Master Sook's face, leaving it the color of ash. All around the courtyard, the entire household staff had gathered to watch. Jean stood among them, his face grim and still. Master Kwan's voice became cold and hard as winter stone. "Get out of this house, and never show your face before this gate again." Master Sook continued to protest, to offer excuses and pleas, but it was no use. The proof was too clear, too absolute. That night, clutching a single bundle of his own belongings, the steward was cast out of the main gate. The heavy wooden bar fell into place with a sound as final as a tombstone sealing a grave. Hearing that sound, Un, who was standing in the shadows of the women's quarters, quietly closed her eyes. The long, anxious nights were finally over. It was only then that Jean understood everything. He turned to look at Un, and for a long time, he could not find any words. He finally managed to whisper, "The work you were doing, every night." Un smiled, a small, gentle curve of her lips. "You have always worked silently, with your strong back," she said. "I only did what I could, with my hands and my eyes." Tears welled in Jin's eyes. He could say nothing, only bow his head in gratitude and awe. Just then, the little girl, Ari, ran to him and took his hand. Jean gripped the small, warm hand tightly. The mother and daughter he had rescued from the mountain had now, in turn, become the family that saved his life. The next morning, the great house was unnaturally quiet. Usually at this hour, Master Sook would be in the courtyard, his loud, sharp voice barking orders, assigning tasks to the servants. With that voice gone, the silence felt vast and hollow. The servants only looked at each other, whispering in corners. "Is he truly gone?" one asked. "Did you not see him leave last night with his bundle?" The stories were passed from the kitchen to the stables, but no one shed a tear for the steward. The servants who had lived under his thumb, always watching their backs, felt nothing but a quiet, deep relief. Master Quan did not leave his private study all day. He sat with Master Suk's ledger, poring over it from the first page to the last. He had the granary inventories brought to him, and he checked every item, one by one. The more he looked, the more he realized the thefts were not just one or two small things. It was a deep and constant bleeding of his wealth. He finally closed the book and shut his eyes for a long time. This was a man he had trusted, a man he had kept by his side for many years. He had entrusted him with the household finances, with the management of the staff, with matters both large and small. And all that time, the man had been deceiving him, eating away at the foundations of his house like a termite. Master Quan let out a low sigh. "My eyes for judging a man have grown old and weak," he murmured to the empty room. And then he thought of Jean. He remembered Jean on that winter mountain, how he had abandoned the firewood he had worked so hard to gather, all to save a stranger. He remembered how Jean had bowed before him, begging only for a single night of shelter for the mother and child. He remembered how Jean had shared his own food and given up his own sleep to keep them alive. And now, those two souls had saved his entire household. The next morning, Master Quan sent for the woodcutter. Jean was in the courtyard, sweeping the fallen leaves with a steady rhythm. He had been up since before dawn, just as he was every other day. Though Master Suk was gone, and the work might have been lighter, Jean still moved from one task to the next, his body in constant, humble motion. "Jean," called Master Quan. Jean stopped sweeping and bowed his head. "Yes, Master Quan." Master Quan looked at Jean for a very long time, his eyes taking in the man who was as much a part of the house as its old wooden pillars. At last, he spoke, his voice quiet. "How many years has it been since you first came to this house, Jean?" "It has been more than 20 years, Master." 20 years, Master Quan repeated, nodding slowly. "And in all that time, you have worked with a single heart." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the empty courtyard. "I trusted Master Suk. I believed him to be a man of his word. But he deceived me." Jean remained silent, his head bowed, listening. "But you," the merchant continued, his eyes returning to Jean. "You were different. In 20 years, you have never once been false." His voice grew softer. "And then there is your wife and the child. They saved this household." Jean lowered his head even further. "It was the work of Un and the little one, Ari. I did nothing." "You did nothing?" Master Quan asked, a faint smile touching his lips. "I was the one who found Un and Ari on that winter mountain. By saving them, it seems I saved this very house in the end. It all began with that one act." Jean kept his head down, unable to find the words. The weight of the moment was too heavy for a simple reply. Master Quan spoke again, his tone now firm and clear. "Jean, you will live as a servant no longer." Jin's head shot up in surprise. "Master Quan, what are you saying?" "I am granting you your freedom," the merchant said. Jean was struck dumb. Freedom. The word meant he would be released from his bond of service. It meant he would no longer have to live within the walls of another man's home, a servant to another man's needs. Master Quan continued, "And I will give you the small house south of the village, with a field to go with it. I will also provide you with enough silver to begin your new life." Jean simply stood there, frozen. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Finally, he managed to whisper, "It is too much. For a man like me, such a grace is far too much." "It is not too much," Master Quan said, his voice sharp and absolute. "Compared to what you have given this house, it is not nearly enough." At those words, Jean fell to his knees on the wooden floor. He pressed his forehead to the planks in a deep, formal bow. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking and his shoulders beginning to shake. "I will never forget this for the rest of my life." He had lived for 20 years in another man's house. He had worked from before the sun rose until long after it set. He had eaten cold rice and slept on a cold floor. He had never owned a house of his own, nor had he ever tilled a piece of land that belonged to him. And now, this man was being told he would have a home. He would have a field. It was so hard to believe, it felt like a waking dream. Later, Un was in the kitchen, stirring a simple soup. Jean came in and stood quietly for a moment before he told her the news. "I have been freed," he said softly. "He gave me a house and a field." The ladle slipped from Un's hand. It clattered against the side of the iron pot with a sharp ring. "Truly?" she whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. Truly. For a long moment, she could not speak. Her eyes filled instantly with tears. She bit her lip hard, but the tears overflowed and streamed down her cheeks. Not wanting him to see, she turned away and wiped her face with the sleeve of her blouse. But Jean had already seen. "Do not cry," he said gently. "I am not crying," she answered, though her voice was thick with sobs. "I am not." Jean said nothing more. He simply stood beside her in the quiet kitchen. In that moment, there was no need for any other words. A few days later, Jean, Un, and Ari walked toward their new home. They followed a small path south of the village, and a soft spring breeze blew around them. Along the path, nameless wildflowers bloomed in bursts of color. Ari ran ahead of them. She would stop to look at a flower, then reach out a small hand when a butterfly fluttered past. Every so often, she would turn back, look at Jean, and break into a brilliant smile. Jean laughed. "Ari, let us go slowly," he called. "The house is not going to run away." The little girl just laughed again, and Un smiled beside him. After a short while, they saw it. A small house stood by the path. The gate was low, and the yard was not large. It had just 2 rooms and a kitchen. But it was their house now, not someone else's. It was a home where they would not have to answer to anyone. Un stopped at the gate and stared at the house for a long time. "It is our home," she said, her voice trembling. "Our home," Jean replied, and his own voice trembled too. From that day on, the 3 of them began their new life. Jean went out to work in the field. It was his own land, and he was tilling it with his own hands. He gripped the handle of the hoe, and a new strength flowed into his arms. Un cooked meals in her own kitchen. The rich smell of rice filled the little house, and white steam rose in a happy cloud each time she lifted the pot lid. And Ari played in the yard, following ants on their journeys and touching the soft blades of grass. Whenever Ari saw Jean returning from the mountain path, the child would run to the gate. One evening, Jean was stacking firewood in the yard. It was firewood for his own hearth, stacked in the yard of his own house. Jean placed each log with care, building a sturdy wall against the coming winter. Sweat beaded on his brow, but a quiet smile played on his lips. When the last log was settled, he brushed the bark from his hands and called out, "Ari, come here and sit with me." The child ran to him, but instead of sitting, she stopped and reached for his hand. It was a tiny thing, soft and smooth. It rested upon Jin's own, a hand made large and rough by the axe and the mountain stones. Jean closed his fingers gently around hers, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the setting sun. The 2 of them sat on the wide wooden bench at the edge of the yard. The sun was sinking behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep rose. A cool evening breeze rustled the leaves. From the doorway of the kitchen, Un watched them. She saw the 2 figures from behind, a large, strong back and a small, trusting one, sitting side by side. Un watched for a long moment before speaking, her voice soft. She said, "You were the first person Ari ever opened her heart to." Jean turned to look at her, his eyes meeting hers across the small yard. He gave a slow, silent nod. Just then, Ari leaned her head against Jin's sturdy arm. He began to stroke her hair with a slow, steady rhythm. Un came and sat beside them on the bench. The 3 of them sat in a line, watching the last colors fade from the sky. No one spoke. There was no need for words. The quiet warmth between them was more comforting than any speech. In that stillness, Jean, Un, and Ari became a family. I am told the full story eventually spread through the village. It was the tale of a woodcutter who threw away his day's labor to save a stranger. It was the tale of a child who could not speak, yet brought a great wrong to light. And it was the tale of a man who, by giving up a bundle of wood, gained everything. The old people in the village would nod when they heard it. Jean had thrown away his firewood on the mountain pass that day. It was all he had to show for a long day of work. But in its place, he found a person. He found a family. He found a home and a new life. What came back to him was worth more than all the firewood in the mountains. They say that what is thrown away for a good reason always returns 100-fold. He gave the little he had, and it was enough. Would you have dropped your own bundle of wood on that lonely path, I wonder?
Very impressive, little one. You're getting faster.